Welcome to another episode of the MapScaping podcast. My name is Daniel and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. My guest on the show today is Lauren Guy. Lauren is the CTO and co-founder of a company called ASTERRA, and he's actually been on the podcast before, and you'll find a link to that in the show notes of this episode. And today on the podcast, we're talking about L-band and synthetic aperture radar. So the title of this episode is Why You Should Care About L-band. So I spent a long time thinking about titles. How do I get people interested in L-band? Getting you interested in L-band starts with a title, a good title. So again, the title of this episode is Why You Should Care About L-band. But it could have also been called the business of L-band, or plumbing from space, or what the hell is L-band, or see more with synthetic aperture radar, look beyond the visual, or 7 ground penetrating true facts about L-band. Number 6 will surprise you. So again, I think a lot about this kind of stuff. And I knew when I got to the last one there that I'd gone too far. I'd overthought it. And that's why this episode is called Why You Should Care About L-band. Just before I get started, I want to remind you that every time I feature a company on this podcast, I ask them to help contribute, to cover the costs of producing and promoting their podcast episode. And some companies say yes, and other companies say no. Lauren Guy and ASTERRA said yes. They said yes to helping, to help keep this podcast running. And when a company says yes, they don't just say yes to covering the cost of creating their own episode, they say yes to helping cover the cost of every episode that is published. And I really appreciate that. So thank you very much, Lauren. Thank you very much, ASTERRA. I really appreciate your support. Okay, let's get into the interview. Let's hear from Lauren Guy, your CTO and co-founder of ASTERRA, and let's find out why we should care about L-band. Hey Lauren, it's a pleasure to have you back on the podcast. You are still the CEO and founder of a company called ASTERRA. We're going to talk about more about what ASTERRA is during this episode, and hopefully we're also going to answer the question why people should care about L-band.
Yeah, so thank you for having me again. My name is Lauren Guy. I'm a geophysicist from Israel, as you can see with my accent. I founded ASTERRA around 11 years ago in 2013. ASTERRA is quite unique because we are using L-band and using synthetic aperture radar for commercial usages, which you don't usually see. About my background, as I said, I'm a geophysicist. During my studies here in Israel, in Ben Gurion University and the Hebrew University, I worked on different SAR projects. I think the most interesting one is using SAR on finding indications of water in other planets, and more specifically Mars. And this is how I got to know SAR, water, and this entire industry.
I think it'd be a great time to mention that you've been on the podcast before, hence the welcome back to the podcast. I'll put a link to that previous episode in the show notes. And I got to say, that's well worth listening to. I really enjoyed that last conversation with you, and I find myself referring back to it time and time again on this podcast and in other conversations. So to the listeners, please take the time, check out that link in the show notes and listen to that. It's fantastic. You mentioned L-band, and this is part of the promise of this podcast episode. Why should people care about it? Can we start with this basic idea of bands first and then sort of move off and talk about L-band in specifically within synthetic aperture radar? So a lot of the listeners will be familiar with the visual spectrum, taking visual images of the Earth from satellites. They might think of RGB, the red, green, blue bands at a range of between 400 and 700 nanometers. This represents the visual spectrum. Does SAR have the same thing? We call it L-band. Do we also have these sort of defined blocks where people usually collect data?
Yeah, definitely. So we can take a step back for a second and speak about the electromagnetic spectrum. So as you said, most of the remote sensing knowledge or most of the remote sensing information is within the optical light. Optical, maybe a little bit in the infrared, and so on and so on. As you said, those are very short wavelengths, around the nanometers. When we speak about SAR, synthetic aperture radars, we are speaking on a much longer wavelength in the microwave spectrum. Microwave and a little bit of the radio. It's a total different animal. So if we are speaking about wavelengths of around a few nanometers in optical, in the visual light, in microwave we are speaking about wavelengths in the magnitude of a few centimeters or tens of centimeters or even meters. So when we're speaking about SAR, we are speaking about microwave. Now, every section within the microwave is divided into different bands, depends on the length of the wavelength. There's X and C and P and AU. There are many, many bands. We are using L-band. L-band is the longest wavelength possible right now of using synthetic aperture radar. It has around 30 centimeters of wavelength, which is the frequency of around 1.3 gigahertz. And L-band is great. It has many, many good capabilities. The main one is that it can penetrate the ground all the way from space.
Wow. And these other bands can't do that at all, or they're just not as good as L-band?
It's a tricky question because every band has its own benefits. But no, if you go to a little bit shorter wavelength than L-band, you go to C-band or X-band, those cannot penetrate the ground. There's like a rule of thumb that you can penetrate the ground around 5 to 10 times the wavelength. If L-band has a wavelength of 30 centimeters, you can penetrate the ground around 1.5 meters, 2 meters, 3 meters. If we are speaking about other wavelengths like X and C, their wavelengths are just a few centimeters, 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters. So you can only penetrate around 10 centimeters. So actual penetration is only available with L-band.
Okay, so we're going to come back to that in just a second. X and C, could you give us an idea, what would those bands be good for, or what are they typically used for?
Yeah, so actually the most common SAR band there's out there is X-band, is not L-band. X-band is well known. X-band is well used, mostly in the defense industry, because as you can imagine, and I didn't say that in the beginning, SAR can penetrate the atmosphere. And it's an active satellite, meaning you're not relying on the light from the sun, meaning that you can take an X-band satellite, illuminate Earth, and see every location on Earth, day and night, any weather, and see the ground. Now, the reason they're using X-band mostly is because X-band has a great resolution of a few centimeters or sub-meter, which is not the case with L-band because L-band has a much lower energy and it's all connected to energy. So for most applications, again, it's mostly defense application within SAR because of the inherent capabilities of SAR. The most common one is X-band. There's a lot of constellations, actually private constellations of private companies like Umbra and others. And they are providing great images, again, mostly for defense industry. Unfortunately, because I'm a big advocate of using this technology for environmental studies and environmental commercial solutions and not necessarily defense.
So that means that like there are other use cases for it. It's just that, most of the money, the best business use case is for the defense industry.
Correct. SAR is being used for a long time, not for our usage, which is a bit different. And I'm going to get into that. What are the other capabilities of L-band? But yes, it's being used for a long, long time, mostly in the X-band for reconnaissance applications.
Okay, so back to L-band. You mentioned one of the things, it can penetrate the ground. Great. What else can it do? What are some of the other advantages of this?
So we need to think about it a little bit differently. So again, everyone knows the optical spectrum and the way that we see images is what we see with our eyes. The RGB, we just get the light back into our eyes and we interpret what we see with our eyes. In SAR, it's different. SAR is actually measuring electrical properties. You get signals back. It's signal processing, meaning that every wave that you are getting back has a certain value that represents the electrical properties of the material that it interacted with on Earth. And even more than that, and I didn't mention that, SAR is also divided into different sectors based on the polarizations of the images. In most cases, it's single polarizations, which is HH. It's the most common one, and it's the easiest one to achieve. And if you go to the other side of the spectrum, it's called polarimetric SAR. It's the usage of different polarizations within SAR to get additional information. And I think this is the great thing about L-band, that you can combine different polarizations to derive information from the soil. So if I connect that to your question, is that you are from every substance on Earth or below Earth, because we can penetrate the ground, you are getting different signals. And as we all know, every material on Earth has a different dielectric properties. So if you know in advance what is the dielectric property of the material that you are looking for, then you can find it and you can enhance that and you can have a great target detection tool based on the electrical properties of the materials that you're looking for.
Could you just explain polarizations to me, please, just before we move on?
Yeah, so I know it's going to be a lot of technical terms and a lot of numbers, and I know it's not the best usage of podcast platforms speaking about those things. But in a nutshell, we are all seeing light in a single polarization, meaning you are getting the light in a certain way. Think about the wave going up and down. Sometimes we have glasses that can polarize the light, and then we see different colors.
Could we think of this in terms of filters then?
Yeah, it's some kind of a filter that changes the polarization. And if you change the polarization, you can get different information because you are changing the signals that you are getting back. So if you use 4 polarizations, you're actually getting 4 different signals from one target in any given time.
Wow.
So it's like a cheat code to get more information from one image. So actually one image is constructed from different values because of the different polarization.
But when you do that, when you use different polarizations, this is something that's not done at the time of imaging, right? This is in the post-processing.
No, this is actually being done in the time of the image. So actually, the antenna is sending a pulse in horizontal signal, and then it changes very fastly, and it sends one in the vertical way, and it's also received it in different ways. So it's being done on the sensor.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for walking me through that.
And again, I know it's quite different. It's quite difficult to describe it, but yeah, in the simpler term that I can say, it's just the direction of the wave oscillates when you get it back.
Cool. Interesting. Okay, so the advantages. Okay, now I'm a super fan of L-band, but it's never always just positive. So what are the disadvantages of this?
So as I hinted a few sentences ago, it doesn't have the best resolution because of the low energy that those wavelengths have. For example, in L-band and in most of the available satellites, the main one is ALOS-2 by the Japanese Space Agency, JAXA. The second one is SAOCOM by the Argentinian Space Agency, CONAE. They have a spatial resolution of around 10 meters. Now, if you say 10 meters to any remote sensing specialist, he will laugh at you. Yeah, it sounds awful. But that's the game. That's the trade-off. Yes, you get a very bad spatial resolution, but you get a great radiometric resolution, which is something quite tricky. What is radiometric resolution? Radiometric resolution is the resolution of the targets that you are seeing. How well can you differentiate between different targets within those 10 meters or between the different pixels? So although the resolution is not great, you can get a lot of very valuable insights. And in any other remote sensing applications, you can play with the values and resample and make a better resolution. Of course, there are other trade-offs. But yeah, this is the main issue with SAR, especially L-band, is the resolution. Also, another very, very common shortcoming, and I think it's quite apparent from our discussion up until this point, it has a very high entry point. It's not as intuitive as optical. It's usually not something that you're being learned in the universities or in most commercial companies. It's quite a niche. So there's a very high entry point, but I do think it's quite interesting. You know, from what I see here in Israel, mostly, most of our employees are geologists and geographers and geophysicists like myself and biologists and so on and so on. And I don't know if that's the case in other countries, but in those fields, mathematics is not the main thing and physics is not the main thing. And SAR is. So, you know, it's very overwhelming and it's very intimidating for many, many new employees or many, many new students when they see that. And they are being drawn automatically to the optical spectrum because it's much, I don't want to say easier, but it's much different and it's much more intuitive. So as an employer, it's very hard to find employees in that because everyone is being, again, I don't want to say hard word, but it's very difficult to get into that. But I do think it's very rewarding because you see so much that you don't see with your eyes. You know, people don't realize that the visual light is only 0.003% of the spectrum. It's nothing. We are blind. There's so many information around us that we don't see. Now, if you speak about the microwave spectrum and the radio spectrum, it's 15% of the spectrum. So 15% opposed to 0.003%. This is so many information that if someone will take the risk and try to get into that, and I say risk, quote unquote, I think it's so rewarding because there are so many around us that we can see.
Now, I remember from our previous conversation, there was something about noise and cell phone towers as well.
Correct. And yeah, that's another big shortcoming. Thank you for reminding me. As I said, L-band is around 1.3 gigahertz. And if that number sounds familiar to you, it's the same frequency as cell phones, mostly the older generations of 2G and 3G. So if you take an image of an urban environment, and this is what usually you want to do in commercial solutions, and this is what we do in ASTERRA, you get a big white cloud of noise because you are gathering all the informations of all the cell phones within that city. That's why when you look on research of L-band, it's usually in the middle of nowhere. So as I said, I worked on L-band in Mars. There are no cell phone on Mars, so everything is quiet. And usually you see researchers in agriculture and in deserts because those are the environments that you can work with L-band because there's no noise. And one of the biggest obstacles of using L-band for commercial urban solutions is overcoming the noise. So yes, I know ASTERRA is looking for water and other things, but actually 90% of our IP is cleaning noise. We are a noise cleaning company because you want to use your IP and you want to use your signal processing capabilities to remove the noise. And let's take, for example, we are taking an image of London in the UK. We want to remove the noise as much as possible to make London appear in Mars with no cell phones. And once you do that, then you can get the information that you need from the soil, which is actually great because those 90% of noise removal, they are the same 90% for any solution that we are doing. So you need to change only the other 10% of the actual substance that you are looking for. So that's great for scaling up, which is of course great for startups. But yes, noise is a big, big issue. And we found that the way to overcome that is using pulsar, polarimetric SAR, because using the polarizations, we can actually define what is the noise, what is the source of the noise. Yes, noises can come from cell phones, but they also can come from ground radars, from airports. They can come from high-rise tall buildings and other sources. Sometimes vegetation can change the polarization and create chaos. So yeah, that's the big obstacle, for sure.
Yeah, I remember that. Like I say, I remember that from my previous conversation. There was something there, and it was worth asking you about that again.
You know, it's funny for me. It's such a day-to-day thing that I forgot to speak about that. But yeah, noise is a big issue.
It must be a big issue if you describe yourself as a noise cleaning company. That's fantastic.
Yeah. And when I give presentations visually, I always love to show an image of San Francisco. In most remote sensing applications, when you give, in the academy, when you give some example, you give San Francisco.
Yeah.
For some reason, I don't know the origin of that. But I give an example of San Francisco and you see the big white cloud of noise in the downtown area. Then I go to the next slide and then everything is dark. And it's so different. And then you can see the issues that you are looking for.
We talk about cell phones and cell phone towers. I think you said mostly 2G, 3G. Is this getting better as people are moving on to 4G, 5G? Or is it just a different problem to solve?
Yes and no. Yes, as we go to 4G and 5G, those are much shorter wavelengths, so they are not in the L-band necessarily. By the way, they are going toward the X-band in those bands, but it does help us in L-band. But we do see a lot of issues right now with airports because radars are there to stay, and there are new systems called ADS-B systems in airports and aircrafts that can cause issues for us. And, I live in Israel, which is a big defense country. When you take an image of Israel, you see nothing because of the radars. And I don't know if you know that, and I don't want to get deep into that, but lately, because of all of the issues, we're jamming GPS signals in Israel. So if you go on Waze or some other driving application, you are like 50 kilometers away from your location. So imagine the chaos that it also creates for our images here in Israel. So yeah, there's so many sources that can deviate your signals. And I think, as I said, the main IP is to actually identify what is the source and remove it smartly.
Yeah. Wow. But after all of that, you still love L-band. It's still the one.
Yeah, L-band is amazing. I have a funny story. I recruited a person into the company a few months ago. And every time I recruit a person, I give them an exam to do at home. So one of the exams that I gave him, actually her, it was a lady, one of the exams I gave her is, please analyze a certain location in Nevada, US, that I want to find different things. And please use those polarizations and those images. And she had a great test. And then I called her to my office to have a verbal interview. And she actually printed the output of that image on a canvas and gave it to me because it was so pretty. You can get so much information. Now, I told her looks like a bribe that you are giving me a canvas as a gift, but it was so beautiful. She doesn't work with us now, but I didn't accept her from other reasons. But that was so lovely. And yeah, I love Elben. It gives you so much information that you cannot see with your eyes. And it's amazing. It's amazing.
Has anybody ever accused you of being a geek?
Every day, especially for my wife and my kids. When everyone asks my kids, what do I do? And I have big kids. I have a son which is 13, a daughter which is 10, and a daughter which is 6. They cannot explain, my dad is doing things with SAR and those kind of things. So they have one answer. He's a plumber from space. That's what they usually say, which is great. I love that nickname. I embrace it quite nicely. But yeah, I'm a geek. I love video games. I play music. Yeah, I'm proud to be a geek. I think being a geek in 2024 is much better than being a geek in 2020 or 2000 or something like that.
Totally. I totally agree. And you should embrace it. Beautiful segue, by the way, a plumber from space. So my next line of questions was to try and understand, okay, what are the use cases? Again, I'd like to refer back to our previous conversation for people because you go into much more detail there. But maybe you could start with, being a plumber from space. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so as I said, most of the applications with SAR are defense applications. And especially if you live in Israel, most of the times you're going to the defense industries. I said that I don't want to do that. I want to help the environment. I want to help Earth. And I was amazed to learn that water leakages is a big issue all around the world. 30% of the water, 30% of the water that are being lost in the pipes between the reservoirs that they are being taken from or from the desalination plants to your house. They are being lost along the way. In the UK, it can get to 50%. In the US, it can get to 40%, but that's a lot of water. But that's not just the amount of water. 20% of the energy of the US, Australia, UK, any other Western country, 20% of the energy is pushing water. Now imagine out of those 20%, 30% is just going into the ground. So 7% of the energy of the country is just going into the waste, which is crazy. So as I said, during my studies, I worked on finding liquids on Mars. So I said, we can do the same here on Earth. We can find water. And not just any water, we can find leakages. If you are recalling, I said that if you know the dielectric properties of different materials, you can detect them with L-band. So if I know exactly what is the dielectric properties of treated water opposed to other kinds of water, I can find it under the ground. And if I see it under the ground, it has to be a leakage. From space, I can say if the water in your cup came from the tap or from the rain or other stuff based on the conductivity, which is derived from the salinity of the water. So yeah, we find leakages from space all around the world. Up until now, we found, verified, digged, and fixed 118,000 leakages all around the world. We're working with 65 countries, and that's the great thing about working with satellite. We can task it everywhere we want. We have one algorithm that can work everywhere, and we're very proud of that we cracked the way how to do commercial usage of L-band. And I must say that we are out there for the last 11 years. We are still, and I'm not saying it proudly because I do want to see other commercial companies. We are still the only commercial L-band company out there, which is crazy, I think. But I do think it's going to change because you see more and more satellites are being launched in L-band and you do see the traction. So I do think the next 10 years are going to be much, much more interesting. Also, NASA is launching a satellite, which I'm sure is going to get a lot of users and commercial usage and so on and so on. And you are also seeing that most of the satellites are going to be free in the next few years, which is also going to bring competition, which is great. So I think the future is very, very nice if you're speaking about L-band.
Yeah, towards the end of this conversation, I want to dive into the business of this, but I think we should leave that for now. I remember last time we talked, you were also talking about mineral detection. Are you doing that now?
Yeah, so that was funny. So as I said, I'm a plumber from space, but we always knew that we can do much more than that. And again, we don't want to be drawn into the defense industry. So we looked for other things that we can achieve with our technology. So we did a contest in the company and every employee suggested an idea that we can go to. And one of the ideas that we chose was mineral detection and more specifically lithium. I know the mining industry is much more of a gray area than leakages. But we did choose lithium because lithium is the future for EV vehicles and all of that. So we actually built a solution to find lithium in the ground, deep in the ground. And we did a lot of tests in the last few years, which was quite successful. Actually, if you Google ASTERRA and lithium, you will see that we found a big reservoirs of lithium in the US. And yeah, it was quite successful. Actually, it was so successful that we spinned off this technology to another company.
Oh, wow.
So it's not a part of ASTERRA right now. It's another company because this is such a different industry and this is such a different business case and business usage than ASTERRA. So we spin it off to another company. But yeah, it was very interesting to see that we can also find minerals deep in the ground.
So obviously that there was that business case around lithium, but would, like, in terms of being able to detect other minerals, was lithium just better? Was it easier, or was the business case was there? I mean, I guess what I'm getting at was this the same potential. If I had said something like gold, silver, aluminium, can you go find that as well?
Yeah, so lithium was a natural choice for us, both from the business point of view, but also from a technical point of view, because lithium has a great electrical properties. That's why we're using it in batteries. So it was great for us to start. But every other material, every other mineral, and I'm a geologist in my bachelor degree, every other mineral has a certain dielectric property. So if you know what you're looking for, yes, you can detect it. And as you can imagine, when I walked in the biggest mineral conference in Toronto, it's called PDAC last year, I was sure that everyone will be amazed with the lithium stuff. But no, everyone is interested with gold and copper and those kind of things. So that was naturally the question that always are rising up. And yes, that's why we spin it off to another company because there's so much to do over there. And yes, we are building solution to other minerals as well.
If we go back to, being a plumber from space, talking about water leakage, because this is what you're still doing in terms of your work with ASTERRA today. What about soil moisture mapping, for example? Is that the same as finding leaking drinking water?
Actually, it's much easier if it's funny, because when you're looking for leakages, you're looking for a very specific kind of water. You are looking for a very specific target detection. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack because you're looking for a very small target. And let me remind you, it's a 10-meter resolution pixel.
Yeah.
So you're looking for a very small target in a very chaotic environment within an urban city. If you're speaking about soil moisture in general, and this is our other solution, and thank you for asking that, we are providing soil moisture maps. And why it's easier? Because you measure any kind of water and you are measuring any kind of moisture. So we are creating those maps. But unlike other solutions or indices that you see mostly around soil moisture, sometimes it's derived from thermal bands, sometimes it's derived from SAR applications. But in most cases, it's indices. What we did, and we also did that in our first solution, which is the leakages, we always build our solution from bottom up, meaning we are not building indices. We are getting samples from the soil all around the world, and we are tasking the satellites to go at the same time above us. And we correlate from what we saw in the ground to what we saw with the satellite. So we create a very accurate model to predict not only the trend of the soil moisture, but also the actual percentage of soil moisture. So yes, we provide soil moisture maps mostly for infrastructure purposes. Not a lot of people knows that, but the biggest enemy of infrastructure, like bridges, rail tracks, highways, is soil moisture. 75% of the issues around infrastructure are being caused because of high soil moisture, which is not drained correctly, or they are being in a place that they shouldn't be. Sinkholes is the obvious things that comes to mind, but also landslides and other stuff. So if we can, from space, monitor large, huge areas with a SAR image and pinpoint the utility or the client to exact locations where we see high soil moisture around key infrastructure, and they can go and fix it, that's a big game changer. And yes, this is our second product when we launched it a few years ago, and there's great traction around that. And we're not only saving water now, and I don't want to sound too corny, but we also save lives, and we have some actual cases that we encountered.
That's really interesting. Typically, when I hear people talk about SAR and infrastructure monitoring, they're talking about building these incredibly high resolution digital models of urban environments and saying, oh, this one has moved by 5 millimeters. This is sinking. This is being lifted up. This is moving. But you're saying, we're using it to look at the soil moisture content, see if it's changing, if it's high, if it's low, and then saying to people, hey, look, you've got a problem here. It's going to be sinking soon because, you've got high soil moisture.
Yeah, you actually described a very common solution with SAR. It's called INSAR, interferometric SAR. We are not doing it in ASTERRA, but that's the most common usage of SAR outside of the defense market. And INSAR basically is stacking a lot of images on top of each other. Sometimes it's tens of images to find changes in the soil, but not from a soil moisture point of view, but from a height point of view. So you can detect very, very small changes or movement in the soil. And although the resolution is 10 meters, you can actually see changes in the magnitude of a few centimeters, which is great. The issue with that is that you need tons of images to get that. And as I said, SAR is an active satellite, it's not a passive one. So it can take months to gather the information. Unlike Pulsar, this is what we do, we actually operate with one image only. It can help us a lot. But yeah, INSAR is a very great solution for other purposes. And yeah, mostly in infrastructure is to detect, movement in the soil for some purposes and so on.
This might be a very naive question, but can you see the difference between saltwater and freshwater?
Yeah, and that's what we do here in ASTERRA. As I said, we are seeing treated water, so we can see the difference. And the difference is because the salinity of the water is different, and salinity affect conductivity. And that's why we see the difference. But yes, we can even see the difference between water being treated from your tap to rain, which is also quite clean water. So you can even detect those very, very small changes.
In terms of soil moisture mapping, do people care about what kind of water it is, or they just want to know, is there water here and how much?
So it depends. There are some solutions that they care about that because they want to know the source of the soil moisture. For example, if there's a certain utility that they care about soil moisture around the rail tracks, but they want to know that this soil moisture is coming from a nearby water pipe that belongs to another utility, they want to know the composition of the water. So it depends on the solutions. And in other cases, some utilities, I don't care, just let me know where's the soil moisture and I'm going to take care of that.
Yeah. Hey, earlier on, you mentioned this idea that you don't work with general indices. You go and build your own solutions from the ground up, and you talked about this very elaborate ground truthing that you do. We send people off to different parts of the world and take samples of the soil and task the satellite to take an image of that area while they're doing it. Was this a problem when you go and sell this? When you go and try and get people to buy into this, to buy your soil mapping solution, for example, they might be used to working with indices. Is it difficult to get them to understand, we're doing things slightly differently?
Yeah, and I'm not saying it is a bad thing about other applications, but the market is so used to a certain way of looking at stuff. And this is indices and DVI and those kind of things. So when you come to a certain client which knows remote sensing, and by the way, most clients don't know anything about remote sensing, especially in the governmental or utility sector. So they have some insights about those kind of things. Maybe they have some bad past information or some bad experience and those kind of things. So yeah, we always need to relearn them and teach them that this is totally different. And this is very actionable. So there are some cases that people are using indices and they are super happy. For them, those indices are usually being taken into other models. They are taking it into consideration, but not as an actionable insight. It's just a general information. And what we give, opposed to that, we give very actionable, specific information. You go to that location and you fix that location based on our information and no other information. So for them, yes, it's a change of thinking about that, is that ASTERRA is giving them actionable insight and you need to work according to what ASTERRA is telling you instead of just taking this information and, Internet of Things, just getting it into your information and, make other considerations and so on and so on. So yes, it's quite a change of way of working. But if the clients see the benefits of that, of course, they are on board since the second moment.
Yeah. No, so for the listeners who are in doubt now, we've moved on to the sort of business side of the podcast, which I remember from our last conversation was really interesting talking to you about this. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to dive into this just a little bit deeper. So you talked about actionable insights. What does that mean then for your water leak detection solution, for your soil moisture mapping solution? How do you deliver that to them? Are you delivering that to them as a map, as a CSV file, as a what? What do they want?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So since day one, we said that ASTERRA is not a project-oriented company. We are a SaaS company. meaning that we have an application, it's called EO Discover, that every client has access to. And we push information into that application every month, every quarter, it depends on the client. And it just logged in into the system. It's also on his cell phones, and then he sees what are his tasks to do today or the next few days. And he just go and fix it, and then he report back. And that's a great thing for us, not only from the stickiness point of view that the client is using our systems. It's also enable us to perfect our algorithm because everything is AI based. And I know everyone is saying AI all the time, but we actually gather the information back into our system. So for example, I send the client to a certain location and I say, hey, listen, there's a leak here. And he finds nothing and he reports back that there's nothing in that location. Then it gets to our system and our system learns, okay, it didn't work on that location. I guess it's because of that and that and that, because we gather information from the soil and other stuff, or maybe noise or those kind of things. And then it changes the algorithm a little bit. Or the opposite, we see a leak and it was great. Then it enhanced that kind of solution within our AI solutions. So that's great that we are closing the loop, and you don't see a lot of remote sensing applications closing the circle of delivering and also collecting the information back about what happened actually in the field. So for us, it's great.
This is getting back to that idea of actionable insights, because my guess is a lot of companies in Earth observation are delivering their data as a CSV file, as something else that gets put into a model and used with a whole bunch of other data. So there's probably very little opportunity to close the loop to get that ground truth that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very different from what they're used to.
How did you convince people to do that? Or is that what they asked for? Or was this you saying, this is the way it is?
When I launched the company 10 years ago, I was sure everyone will be standing in line because it's so cool. But no, I learned the opposite, because people don't care about the way that you are bringing them the solution. They just care about the solution. So they don't care you're bringing it from space. They don't care you're using SAR or, some fancy words or things like that. They just want an actual working solution, and especially in a very old-fashioned markets like utilities and governments and those kind of things. So it was really an uphill battle dealing with that. And if you connect that to the issue of that, we are working from space, and for most people it sounds like crazy talk. It was very hard to do to justify what we are doing, and sometimes people looked at us as charlatans or those kind of things. So in the beginning, it took us a lot of time to teach the market that this is a viable solution. And of course, the only way to do that is to show them actual results. I always joke that the best selling tool that we had in the beginning, as Israelis, we can be sometimes quite not PC or not very nice. So sometimes we went to a certain utility in the first sell pitch, and we also already analyzed the city in advance. So when we went to that client and to the utility manager, we showed him on the map where are all of these issues is and where are all of his leakages. And he just looking at the screen, he said, "Who told you about that? Why are you looking at my cities? Why are you seeing my leakages?" It's like a big punch to their faces, because we can see the things that they are, quote unquote, trying to hide. And this is the best selling tool. If you can frighten the other side, you can sell in an instant. So yeah, it was a battle, but as we gain confidence in the system and as the clients gain confidence in the system, and of course we are not perfect even today. When we launched the solution, our success rate was only 20%, meaning out of 10 locations, only 2 were correct. And as a scientist, it sounds awful, but that was twice better than what they had. So even with 20%, we had a great commercial solution. But right now, where we are around 86%, 90%, wow. Of course, the market trusts us much more, and we trust the solution much more. And yeah, it's much easier right now.
Do you think you would have been able to get to that 80% or 90% that you said before as quickly without that direct feedback that we were talking about earlier?
So it's a funny question, because as a geophysicist who knows nothing about AI, I want to say that my algorithm brought it to 86% and that's it. But no. Actually, we had some kind of a glass ceiling of around 60%, 50% that we could not break, only based on geophysics, because of the chaotic nature of SAR and that you cannot predict everything. Once we incorporated the AI solutions and we actually built AI department only 4 years ago, something like that, then we cracked down the issues and we went to the 86 and 90%. And yeah, it's all based on the feedback from the system. That's why I'm always advocating. And when I'm speaking to other people in the remote sensing solutions, don't be afraid to close the circle. Don't be afraid to close the loop. Don't be afraid to request the information back because it can only benefit you. And especially today when we have ChatGPT and AI and so many tools that even I can use some kind of AI application and create things. Yeah, that's the future.
Yeah, I'd agree. But I guess faced with that burden of education, just like you were, I'm showing up from Israel and I'm a plumber from space, and trying to educate people around that this is possible. We're not charlatans. We're not kidding. We can do this. And like, okay, and here's another app that you have to use. You're just adding more barriers to entry. But I can, it sounds like it was incredibly beneficial for you.
Yeah. So yeah, the growth was quite slow in the beginning. And, as a startup, you want to double your revenues every year, but that wasn't the case in the beginning because of this very high barrier of entry. And if you ask Loren of 15 years ago and ask him, are you sure you want to go into the water market? I would say, please don't go to the water market, try to find other market because this is a very hard market to penetrate. But on the flip side, it's a very sticky business. So if you are good and if the clients likes you, they're here to stay. But yeah, we see the dividends of that now because right now the scaling up and the revenues, they are going much more rapidly when the market trusts you. So yes, it's a uphill battle, especially for startups, not a lot of resources and capital. I'm always very proud to say that ASTERRA only raised $9 million in 10 years, which is nothing. If you see other startups, they are raising 30 million, 50 million, almost every couple of years. So raising only $9 million and getting actual revenues, and if we can be break even today or even get profit. It's crazy. And I'm so proud to say that we have 90 employees. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, congratulations. That sounds like a lot of hard work, to be perfectly honest. Well done. So we've talked about L-band and why it is amazing, and I agree. It sounds incredible. Maybe slightly too complicated for someone like me, but I can when you talk about it, I can see the potential in it, and you can clearly see the potential in it as well. And you said earlier on that hey, you were surprised that there weren't many other commercial L-band companies, but you also made a prediction that they are coming. Would you ever consider buying your own satellite to protect your data source, to own the data source?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I said, we are using different satellites, but they are not commercial satellites. They belong to space agencies and they are not commercially oriented. So sometimes I ask for an image and they just say no. Why? Because there's no reason. They just don't want to give me the image from their point of view. And as a commercial solution, of course, it's an issue for me because if I promise the client an image tomorrow, I need to provide an image tomorrow. Of course, we can mitigate that as we have more and more satellites being launched. But yes, it's a big issue sometimes. So yes, we have aspiration to launch our own satellites, and we are being deep into discussion in the last couple of years with very big names to do that. Hopefully, we will have something to say in the next 12 months about that. But yeah, we have to control our own destiny. That's the only way that we can provide reliable SLA to our clients.
When you think about launching your own satellite, in a perfect world, how many satellites would that be? Is it a massive constellation or would one be enough?
No, it depends on the solution. So up until now, our solutions are not mission critical, meaning that, I'm looking for a leakage. So I don't have to find it now. I can find it next week and nothing will happen. So having an image every week, every few days is okay. But as we move forward, and I can give you a great example, ASTERRA has a patent about finding gas leakages. We have it for the last 6 years, but we are not selling it because we cannot provide an image every day. Because if there's a gas leak, you need to know today, not next week. So as we move to more satellites and being able to take an image every day, we can move to more mission critical solutions like gas leakages, like maybe agriculture, maybe other stuff. And it can open a big umbrella of other solutions for us. So yes, so we aim to have an image every day or even a few times a day. And in order to get that, we need a constellation of around 3-4 satellites. And this is our goal in the next 10 years.
Yeah, you just mentioned gas leakages, and we've also talked about soil moisture mapping and finding treated water leaks from space. Is there a way of kind of summing this up? Like what makes a really great business case for an Earth observation company?
So you need to find a market. That's the biggest issue, I think. Remote sensing, although we come from this field, we know that genre for the last 20 years. I was in the university 20 years ago. So it's not new for us, but it's very, very new to the other side. And yes, you can sell to entities that are using to remote sensing, but in those kind of locations, it's like a red ocean of rivals. There's so many competition. Good and bad, that doesn't matter. But there's so many companies claiming they have remote sensing. There's so many companies. I think the most obvious example is agriculture. There are so many solutions that strive to give solution for agriculture. And I think that from so many solutions, you don't see the actual issues and you don't see actual solutions. So I think the biggest clue that I can give is to try to find a market which is not necessarily using remote sensing today, but it is a technological market that can see the benefits from that. I can give you a great example, the insurance market. Insurance has a great, of course, upside and a lot of money in that. And they're using a lot of resources for underwriting and those kind of things. Imagine that if they can use remote sensing for underwriting purposes. I can give you a great example. Let's say a big insurance company wants to insure a water utility. In order to insure the water utility, they need to know information. So they can take an image of the city, see the actual issues of the city, and decide about the underwriting based on that. Sounds like a great solution. So think about those kind of markets with a lot of money, with actual reason to change and get more upside for their solutions because they can earn more money, and try to strive into those blue oceans that you don't see many competition. And I know in 2024 it's fine to find those. It's hard to find those markets because there are people everywhere and there are companies everywhere. But if you have a good solution, you can definitely stand up and stand out above other companies.
Yeah, I think that's some really great advice. I want to maybe tack something onto that, not being the businessman you are, but when you said like an actual reason to change, I think that's one thing, but I would add like, and also want to change, like they're actively looking to change. Because I think trying to get someone to change who you might think they have a great reason to do it, but unless they think they have a great reason to do it or actually want to change, I think it'd be really hard.
Definitely, and especially in the governmental industries, because the best decision that a water utility manager is making from his point of view is not making any decision because he doesn't want to make changes because he might be liable for them, because he always think about the worst case scenario, and because they are not revenue driven, most utilities, because they are governmental. So pushing those people that doesn't want to change something, that's very hard. And that's why in most cases we try to find the champion with those organizations to push for that. But yeah, the willingness not to change is the biggest enemy of any startup company.
So you've given in the last few minutes here, you've given us some great sort of insight into entrepreneurship and remote sensing Earth observation vertical. I wonder if you could give us some insight into what it's like to be like being a practitioner in the remote sensing Earth observation vertical. What advice would you give a remote sensing Earth observation scientist today, someone working in this field?
So I see it for my employees as well. We are scientists. We come from the academy. We want to have the most perfect solution all the time. And as I said, we were with 20% in the beginning of success rate. And it sounds awful. And, I almost decided not to push that solution into commercialization because, again, as a scientist, it's just not a good number. So the biggest advice that I give people right now is, of course, you have to have a solution. Of course, it has to have some merits and some technical background and some success. But you can start pushing forward even when you are not perfect, because perfection will come as you get more data. And we all know data is key for many other verticals, but especially in remote sensing. And because data is key, you need to assume that your solution will be better. So try to push into commercialization even when you are not perfect. And I think for us, people coming from the science point of view, it's very hard to comprehend and to do that. It's not in our DNA because we want to be perfect. But being in entrepreneurship, you don't have to be perfect. And yeah, that's the biggest advice that I can give.
Thank you very much. Again, I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. I enjoyed the last one, and I'm sure I'm going to be talking about this one a lot as well going forward. So I really appreciate your time. Where can I go? So we mentioned the name of the company, ASTERRA. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Is there anywhere else we can send people if they want to learn more or if they want to follow along?
Yeah, asterra.io is a great location to find more about that. You can approach me on LinkedIn, Lauren Guy. I'm always answering, and I always love to speak with new people. I'm also in a lot of conferences all around the world, so you can always search for my name in remote sensing conferences. And yeah, I think there are many ways to get a hold of us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Lauren. Really enjoyed it. Cheers.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I really hope you enjoyed that episode with Lauren Guy, CTO and co-founder of ASTERRA. There'll be links to where you can connect with Lauren and find out more about ASTERRA in the show notes of this episode. And there'll also be a link to the episode that Lauren's been on before. Really interesting episode. I find myself referring back to it again and again, and I think I'm also going to be referring back to this episode in the future as well. So that's it for me. That's it for this week's episode of the MapScaping podcast. I'll be back again soon. I hope that you will take the time to join me then.